Hey listeners, this is Ben, the Amateur Exegete, and you're listening to episode 49 of Bible Study for Amateurs. Today's episode is, How Art Thou Fallen from Heaven, O Lucifer? I grew up on a steady diet of King James-only dispensationalism. When I was around 15 or so, I received for Christmas my first Scofield Reference Bible. A few years later, for my 18th birthday, my dad purchased a leather-bound, wide-margin version of the Reference Bible that I have to this day. For those of you who may not be familiar with a Scofield Reference Bible or a Scofield Study Bible, it's named for Cyrus Ingerson Scofield, a Confederate soldier turned theologian who is most famous for the reference Bible that bears his name. This isn't the place to talk more about Scofield, but I will say that he was and still is very popular in circles that adhere to dispensationalism, the belief that God deals with humanity in different time periods or dispensations in different ways. Like most reference and study Bibles, the Scofield Reference Bible features notes beneath the biblical texts that are intended to illuminate their meaning. For example, in a note on Genesis chapter 1 verse 2, Scofield claimed that the reference to without form and void in the King James Version signals that the earth had undergone a cataclysmic change as the result of divine judgment. Specifically, he connects it to the fall of angelic beings and cites two texts, Ezekiel chapter 28 verses 12 through 15 and Isaiah chapter 14 verses 9 through 14, that he believed pointed to that event. We will look at the latter in today's episode. Turning to the passage in Isaiah chapter 14, one of the first things that we should take stock of is to whom these words are addressed. We find our answer in verse 3, here from the NRSV. When the Lord has given you rest from your pain and turmoil and the hard service with which you were made to serve, you will take up this taunt against the king of Babylon. So, who is the intended target? The king of Babylon. But what saith Scofield? In his notes for Isaiah chapter 14 verse 12, he writes the following. Verses 12 to 14 evidently refer to Satan, who, as prince of this world system, is the real, though unseen, ruler of the successive world powers, Tyre, Babylon, Medo-Persia, Rome, etc. Lucifer, day star, can be none other than Satan. This tremendous passage marks the beginning of sin in the universe. When Lucifer said, I will, sin began. As precedent for addressing Satan through another, he cites Genesis chapter 3 verse 15 and Matthew chapter 16 verses 22 and 23. I'll let you look up those texts on your own. The difficulty with Scofield's view is that it simply doesn't do justice to the text. Take, for example, the name Lucifer. One might assume that this is a transliteration of the underlying Hebrew, just as the word Jacob from verse 1 is in Hebrew Yaakov, and Israel is Yisrael. But that isn't what's going on here. The name Lucifer comes not from Hebrew, but from Latin, particularly the Latin Vulgate. The Hebrew word is actually Hallel, a term that carries the idea of shining, and is rendered in the NRSV as day star. This day star is described as son of dawn. Taken together, many scholars believe that there is a fall being alluded to, but it isn't Satan's. For example, in his commentary on the passage, R.E. Clements thinks that verses 12 through 15 of Isaiah 14 contain either a fragment of, or at least an allusion to, an ancient myth of the banishment of a divine being from heaven. The title Day Star, Son of Dawn must certainly be a reference to the morning star Venus, and the deity consistently associated in Canaanite mythology with this planet is Et-Tar. The rising up of this planet in the early morning sky, followed by its sudden descent without the completion of a true arc, have found echoes in mythology at more than one point. If this is the case, why does Isaiah employ the myth here? Clements writes that, with the phrase found at the end of verse 12, "You who laid the nations low," Isaiah applies the theme of the myth to the historical achievements of the tyrannical world ruler. In other words, the myth serves as a way of expressing the hubris and downfall of the king of Babylon. It doesn't mean that this is describing something otherworldly, like a power behind the power. It is simply applying the myth to the Babylonian monarch's demise. We use mythological themes in this way even today. How often have we described a co-worker's seemingly impossible task as Sisyphean, a reference to a king from Greek mythology who was punished by Hades to perpetually push a boulder up a hill? Or, if we know of someone who grew too arrogant and reckless, with whom do we compare them in their downfall? Icarus, of course. Mythology is useful in this way, and I think the author of this passage in Isaiah is using a myth with which he was familiar in a similar fashion. There is another problem with Scofield's understanding of this passage. The idea of Satan as a personal being, whose sole purpose is to thwart God's will as his enemy, is all but missing from the Hebrew Bible. Ordinarily, when we read of Satan, in places like the book of Job, we aren't reading a name so much as we are reading a title, typically, the Satan. It isn't until the Second Temple period that we really see personal, adversarial figures like Satan come into their own. For Isaiah to be using Satan the way Scofield suggests is at best anachronistic. Much more could be said about Scofield's erroneous understanding of Isaiah chapter 14. In fact, much more in that chapter signals that his take is problematic, but we simply do not have time to cover that here. It suffices to say that C.I. Scofield's interpretation of Isaiah's diatribe against the king of Babylon, as if he were speaking to Satan, the enemy of Yahweh, leaves much to be desired. That's all the time we've got this week. See you next time, and remember, in the words of Richard Elliott Friedman, one does not need to deny what is troubling about the Bible in order to pay respect to what is heartening. Thanks for listening.